Another guy who probably had a nice little day, depending on how you look at it, is Stetson Bennett. That guy is faster than me. Holy shit. That was really humbling to see. Stetson Bennett could beat me in a foot race. I mean, he could beat the 23-year-old me in a foot race. So for a guy who didn't watch much of the combine, I was in Africa. Now I'm in Anguilla. Admittedly, this is not my strong suit, so I call in the big guns. My guy, Jordan Reid from ESPN, one of the best. He was boots on the ground in Indy. He's back in Charlotte now. How you holding up, man?
I'm good. I wish I could be where you were right now. You're on vacation, living the life right now, man.
Yeah.
While we're out here working hard.
I'm trying to catch up. I'm trying to serve the people a little bit of combine talk, man. So like, what do you think is the biggest story out of there? Is it Anthony Richardson or was it something else?
I think it's a combination of Anthony Richardson, then also this cornerback group as well. Those guys were so the big thing with the group this year with the corners is that it's really deep, and I think from top to bottom, even from early first round guys to day three guys, we saw some really big standouts. So the cornerback groups definitely lived up to the hype, but Anthony Richardson, man, I mean, we knew he was a freak show going in just based on what he showed on tape. But for him to go out and run 4.43 at 6'4", 244 pounds, jump 40.5 inches in the vertical, and then throw the ball with ease the way that he did, it's hard to envision him getting outside of the top 10 just because you hear the comparisons about Josh Allen and Cam Newton. And we both know it's a copycat league in the NFL. Every team wants that type of guy.
Yeah, it's almost worth just taking the risk. I mean, the upside is so high. Potentially, you could reason higher than anybody in the draft. I mean, Bryce Young still seems like the consensus number one. To you coming out of there, I've heard rumblings that it could be Anthony, it could be C.J. Stroud, but where do you think it sits as we as it stands right now?
Well, it's tough to say. I think Bryce still is going to be the first quarterback selected, if I had to guess right now. But Anthony put a lot of pressure on those guys, and CJ did as well. And it's good to see all those guys throw. And Bryce didn't throw just because I knew he wasn't going to throw. He spent the past 2 months trying to bulk up and get as much water weight as he can possible.
Right.
So he wasn't in his top form to throw. And he's going to throw at Alabama's Pro Day, I believe it's March 23rd. So that'll be the first time or the next time that we see Bryce do throw. But it was good to see those other guys go out there and participate.
Will that be the biggest, most anticipated pro day workout, or does his status as kind of like the consensus number one guy mean that it's probably a formality? Like, if there's one pro day this year that's going to buzz like crazy, which one is it?
Yeah, I think it would be his. I think it would be his and probably Jackson Smith and Jigba from Ohio State. Everybody wants to
Hmm.
get a 40 time for him, but he participated in everything else outside of that, and he really helped himself. But everybody's going to be anticipating Bryce's pro day just so we can see him throw the ball around. And, there's a fascination with pro days now for whatever reason. That's like the pinnacle event, especially for these quarterbacks. But the big thing for him was just to get over at least 195 pounds. I think that's the threshold that he had to hit. But for him to come in basically the same size as Kyler Murray, I think that was huge for him.
Did you learn anything about Anthony Richardson and seeing him up close and watching him work away from the football field? As far as like between the whistles and having his workout and jumping and running and all this stuff. Was there anything you learned about him this week?
Yeah, there was a lot. And I mean, the combine really confirmed what we already knew about him. But I think the thing that stood out to me the most about Anthony was just seeing him throw the ball in person. And you see it
Yeah.
on highlights, you go on YouTube and you see it, you watch it on film, of course, but it's just different seeing it up close. And they were throwing go balls at the end of the workout. And, everybody's releasing the ball after they hit their third or fifth step on the drop back. Anthony sits back on his fifth step. He holds the ball and he just flicks it 60 yards down the field with ease. And his ball came out a little bit different than his counterpart. So just seeing him throw the ball up close, he has that easy gas that he can throw to all three levels of the field.
Yeah, that's it. It is like a flick. I mean, he really does have that flick release that you're like, it almost looks nonchalant, but the ball comes out like a missile. And then on the other side of things, you have Will Levis, who said, "I'm going to throw the ball really friggin' hard," and then he comes out and throws the ball really friggin' hard. Like, what's more tantalizing to a QB evaluator, somebody with that effortless flick of the ball 65 yards down the field, or somebody who's topping out at some of these velocity numbers that we've rarely seen at the combine that Will Levis was able to achieve.
You're going to see those guys back to back a lot as far as the comparisons, and you're going to hear the label project quarterbacks a lot. I don't really like
Yeah.
using the label project. I just think they need a little bit more seasoning and coaching. And Levis has much more experience in a pro style system just because he had Liam Cohen, who was the quarterbacks coach for the Rams last year, I
Yeah.
believe. That was his OC back in 2021, back when he had his breakout year. And then he had Rick Scarangello, who has a lot of NFL experience too, that they ended up parting ways with. So Levis has a little bit more experience as far as what he's going to be asked to do on the next level, while Richardson played in a little bit more of a college-oriented offense where there's a lot of pistol formation, where the running back is right behind him, a lot of play action, and then getting him outside of the pocket quite a bit too. So that's going to be a big of a hurdle for Richardson to adjust to as far as reading and reacting to some of the things as far as coverages and things of that nature, while Levis has a little bit more experience in that department. But I think Richardson is the better prospect just because of the mobility. And then I just think the game comes a little bit more easier to him. He's a little bit more looser. I think Will needs to loosen up a little bit. He has a little bit of a stiff lower half, and you kind of see
Yeah.
that on with him a little bit too. I think Richardson's a little bit more of a looser athlete.
Do you think coaches, like, if you're a defensive head coach, do you think you're intimidated at all about drafting as you would put it, as you wouldn't put it, a project quarterback, a quarterback that needs a little bit of, as you put it, like seasoning? Like, do you think that every coach believes, hey, I can develop an Anthony Richardson, I can develop a Will Levis, or do you think that these coaches are self-aware enough to know where they don't have that dynamic quarterback coach or offensive coordinator in the room, or maybe the set of conditions that would make it easier for those guys to transition? Do you think these coaches have the self-awareness to know, hey, maybe that's not in my building? Is it harder for a defensive head coach?
Yeah, I think for a defensive head coach, you're always going to have in mind who would I hate to face, and that's what I think it came down to with Sean McDermott, with Josh Allen, and that he understands that first I have to see who I have to beat in order
Yeah.
to get to the big game. You're seeing guys like Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, and Justin Herbert, all these big time quarterbacks in the AFC. I need that mobile guy that can get me to the promised land just because, and you can attest to this as a former defensive end, it's much easier guarding those guys like a Mac Jones, just
Yep.
because he's not gonna on zone reads. He's gonna give the ball 9 times out
Yep.
of 10. You're not worried about him. But with guys like Anthony and Will Levis, you're really reading your keys just because if you chase the running back, he could take this thing 60 yards to the house. So I
Hmm.
think just little aspects like that. I think defensive coordinators think, who would I be scared to face? And that's why I think they have so much confidence in developing guys like Anthony Richardson and also Will Levis too. But you also have to take into the equation that I think one of the most underrated aspects about Josh Allen's development is that he had Brian Daboll there his first 4 years, which
Exactly.
is very
Yeah.
rare. It's very rare for an offensive coordinator that's had success in the NFL to stay in one spot for 4 years. So that's why if I was a GM, I would be a little bit more at ease if I had an offensive head coach, just because I know that continuity is going to be in place. But with defensive head coaches, what you always fear is that if you have a talented offensive coordinator, that they're going to leave after 2 to 3 years.
Yep.
So with those offense or with those quarterbacks, I would be a little bit more reluctant if I was a defensive minded head coach.
Yeah, that had been my concern with Justin Herbert, and so far he's weathered the storm fine, and we'll see how this year goes. But with Brandon Staley being the defensive head coach, and now that carousel begins, and we'll see how long it goes until they find a really good match for that offense and that quarterback. But I thought that it sounds like C.J. Stroud, who I really like, kind of won the weekend in a weird way because he just was steady. He looked great in his drills. The throws were on point. And everybody else either didn't throw or has some work to do with their mechanics or developing their game. Talk about whether or not you think C.J. Stroud rose or if he just kind of stayed steady in that top five position.
I mean, he just stayed steady. And I tweeted this out. So I was sitting right behind all the quarterbacks in Lucas Oil Stadium. And the best way that I could put it, I said, watching CJ is like watching an ace pitcher in baseball. Like, it's so effortless. Everything is just easy to him. He can hit the corners of the strike zone. He can put it inside of the strike zone when he wants to, and he can get the ball to his desired spots. Nothing is forced with him. His drop back is efficient. Everything about him just screams quarterback. His mental makeup is great. We saw what he was able to do in the big grand finale that I like to say against Georgia, where he was able to answer a lot of questions. And the big thing with him is, can he play outside of structure? And you just have to think, like, he hasn't had to do that. You're throwing to Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Marvin Harrison Jr., and all these weapons that they do have. He just doesn't have to use his legs. But when he was called upon and he had to use his mobility, he was able to do that.
Yeah, and some people might say, well, I didn't see him play that well until he played Georgia in that big shootout, the grand finale, as you put it. But I see that as a real positive, like rising to that level of competition, because that's going to be what you're going to see at the next level. So I'm really high on C.J. Stroud. Another guy who probably had a nice little day, depending on how you look at it, is Stetson Bennett. That guy is faster than me. Holy shit. That was really humbling to see. Stetson Bennett could beat me in a foot race. I mean, he could beat the 23-year-old me in a foot race. He tested relatively well. How did his workouts go? And obviously, he's a late-round guy, but is there any buzz around him?
Yeah, I mean, Stetson as a late-round guy, I think there's going to be some teams that take a chance, maybe like 5th or 6th round, just because you talk about the accolades that he does have, and he's just what I like to call a gamer. Like, he's not going to look great in simulated situations or settings where he's going to have to throw the ball, especially going with guys like Will Levis and Anthony Richardson. He doesn't have the physical gifts or the traits that those guys have, but you put him under the lights and you put him in those game situations, he's going to rise to the occasion. He's like the Case Keenums, the Taylor Heineke's. I think those are two great comparisons for him, of that he's not going to match up well as far as if you line up all those guys and estimate their measurables, but when you put him or you drop him in those game situations, he has that charisma about him. He has that moxie that you love to see at the position. So it wouldn't surprise me if he goes on to have like a Case Keenum type of career, or where he sticks in the league for 15 years as a backup, but then a starter goes down or something, he miraculously leads somebody on the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Like, that wouldn't surprise me. That's just the type of player that he is.
I think maybe we should start looking at him as a wide receiver. I think maybe Stetson Bennett might be the next Julian Edelman. That's what one of our listeners tweeted at me. So with that blazing fast 4.63 40. So wide receiver position, Jackson Smith and Jigba. He's the best wide receiver in the draft. The question is, can he play outside? What do you see as you project him schematically to the next level, and can he answer those questions about playing outside?
Well, he's not going to be able to answer it until he steps on an NFL field, just because he doesn't have any games left collegiately. And I said this yesterday, it was the best wide receiver on-field workout that I've seen since Justin Jefferson in 2020. Like, everything was just efficient with him. He was really quick in and out of his cuts. And this was the first time that we really saw him since he had that nagging hamstring injury. And I think he ran it was like a 3.93 in the short shuttle and like a 6.96 in the 3-cone, which is a ridiculous number. And, that type of efficiency in and out of his cut shows up on tape. Now, he doesn't have great long speed. If I had to guess, he's probably like I think high 4.4s to low 4.5s guys, like 4.48 to 4.52, which is plenty fine. I think he's, you're going to hear comparisons like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Robert Woods, Golden Tate, those guys that were really popular in the slot, but they have gone on to be productive players. And I think he's the best wide receiver in the draft just because of what he's put on tape. And the nagging hamstring injury doesn't really worry me just because he's so polished.
Jordan Addison, the USC wide receiver, kid's not real big, didn't measure real tall, didn't weigh too much, and usually a smaller, slighter guy like that, you're looking for a straight line speed, but he didn't really have that. I mean, he ran well, but as you would put it, but not blazing fast. Who does he comp to, and does that deter anybody how he ran?
So he reminds me a lot of Calvin Ridley when he was coming out of Alabama. That slight frame, but just so sudden and violent and twitchy. That's what I like to call it. And this guy won the Biletnikoff when he was at Pitt. Him and Kenny Pickett had a great season back in 2021, but he transitioned to Caleb Williams in Lincoln Riley's offense, and I thought it played really well, even though it maybe not have been as productive as what we saw a year ago. But I think he's a very good complementary number 2 wide receiver. I think his frame is probably going to keep him from being a true wide receiver one, just because of his play strength is kind of lacking there. Just needs to gain some weight. But as far as a route runner and a pass catcher, he's very, very good at that.
So, we had Zay Flowers, who looks to be explosive, like a big play threat, not the biggest guy, the BC kid. He's probably going to be a middle to bottom of the first round guy, I would figure. Is there a team that you see that's a contender that can use that home run threat that might be high on him?
The Giants. I think the Giants are
Giants.
going to have a lot of interest in Zay Flowers just because they need that playmaker. Depending on who's going to be the quarterback there, I think Daniel Jones is probably going to be back, whether it's on a long-term deal or the franchise tag. I think that's fair to say, but they're really lacking as far as perimeter weapons. And I think Zay Flowers brings that type of explosiveness to the field. He reminds me a lot of Elijah Moore when he was coming out of Ole Miss a couple of years ago. I think that's a very favorable comparison for him.
Let's talk about another Ole Miss comp. This Bryce Ford Wheaton guy from West Virginia. Guy's 6'3", 225. Now, I know it's a deep class, but early in the draft, there's not a lot of big targets like this cat. I mean, you could also throw Quentin Johnson from TCU in there, 6'3" target, who's had a nice week. But when you look at the bigger targets, Bryce Ford Wheaton and Quentin Johnson, what do you see? And especially the West Virginia kid, how high is his ceiling?
So I've actually had a lot of talks about him. So my brother is actually the wide receivers coach at West Virginia. So he
Oh,
had
no
an
way.
opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had an opportunity to coach Bryce Ford Wheaton this year, and he said the kid's absolutely terrific as far as from an athletic standpoint. Does need some polish as far as a route runner, but he said it wouldn't surprise him if somebody beefs him up and turns him into that F tight end type. That wouldn't be surprising either. But I thought he was great at the combine. He looked really good going through the drills, and of course he tested really well too. And then Quentin Johnston, there's some people that actually like him as the first wide receiver off of the board. I think he came in a little bit smaller than expected. They had him listed at like 6'4", 215, and I think he ended up being like 6'2", 210, something like that. So a little bit
Yeah.
shorter than expected, but I thought he was really efficient going through the drills, plays much bigger than his frame indicates, even though he is a big guy. T. Higgins is going to be a common comparison for him. I think that's very good as far as, projecting him on the next level, and it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up going in the top 20.
So let's talk about tight ends, because there's a couple that are pretty interesting to me. First one being Michael Mayer, who didn't test, all that well, depending on what you expected out of him. But, is that something that a month ago, I could have seen him going in the top 5 to 10. Has something changed there, or does the testing not really matter because the tape's so good?
I think it's just the depth of this tight end class. And I mean, we could see as many as 7 or 8 go inside of the top 3 rounds. And the thing about tight end is that it's really hard for those guys to come in and make an immediate impact just because
Yes.
you're really learning 2 positions at once. Just because a lot of these tight ends, they're not asked to block in college. So you're learning how to block. You're learning how to receive as well from a nuance and detail standpoint. So it's really hard for tight ends to come in and make an immediate impact. And it's very rare, especially some of the tight ends that we've seen in years past. Kyle Pitts is still trying to figure out his way around the league. And I think they took him number 4 overall a couple of years ago. So it's just really hard for those guys to come in and make an immediate impact. But what's kind of hurting Mayer is that this is just a deep tight end class. You got guys like Dalton Kincaid from Utah, who's a really good player. Darnell Washington, the big guy from Georgia, who's going to come in and be a really good blocker, and then also a very gifted pass catcher too. And there's plenty of others I can reel off too. Tucker Kraft from South Dakota State, Luke Musgrave from Oregon State. I can go on and on about these names that are probably going to go inside of the top 3. So it's like, why would I take one in the first round when I can come back and get one in the second or third round, and I can take a corner or a wide receiver or edge rusher that I need early on?
Darnell Washington, do you think that Georgia's offense didn't feature him to the degree that he might have liked coming out? Like, do you think that we're scratching the surface a little bit with looking at him as a pass catcher at the next level?
Well, I think they just didn't need him to, just because they
Yeah.
had Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers was so
Yeah.
special, who's probably going to be a top 10 pick this time next year. It's just
Yep.
they didn't need him as far as a receiver, but he's very good as a blocker too. He reminds me so much of Martellus Bennett when he was coming out. I
Ooh.
think he's
Yeah.
exactly like how Marty was, especially from a size and physicality standpoint. I mean, he'll try to bash your face in as a blocker, and then he'll come around, he'll wash you down, and he'll come out for play action and run the under route. So just little things like that. I think he's going to be a really good player on the next level.
Yeah, it's like if you can sit there with your tight end and block an edge rusher and pass pro, that's what like a Martellus Bennett could do early and late in his career. And if you can get that out of Darnell Washington, that's another element to his game. The blocking end of it, as you mentioned, that we don't see tight ends that are pro style anymore. And these guys being able to play pro style tight end and have the athleticism to boot's pretty damn impressive. So when it comes to the edge guys, obviously Will Anderson's a safe pick to be the first guy off the board at that position, I think. Tyree Wilson is a guy who's been mocked up high in the top 5. At first when I watched him, I thought he's a little bit stiff, he's a little bit linear, but man, that length. And if he could play in a more attack-style defense where you might see him getting vertical more, I mean, it felt like a lot of times I'd watch him, he'd be down in his stance, almost in a Reid stance because of that defense, and reacting laterally, playing off people. But if you can get him with a full head of steam, using that length, he could really put it together at the next level. What did he do to bolster his chances of being the second guy picked when it comes to the edge guys this past week?
So, interesting story about Tyree. Coming to the year, I was super high on him. Like, I watched this film from last year. I was like, man, this dude is outstanding. But he's just not developed as a pass rusher. He's that kid at the park that's just more athletically gifted and bigger than everybody. So that's just an adjustment that he's going to have to make on the next level. And I think he did that this year. You started to see some nuances as far as using his hands as a run defender, but also a pass rusher too. But his range as a tackler is just outstanding. Like, he'll be playing 5 technique and they'll run zone read against him. They give the ball to the running back.
Right.
He bounces it outside and he still makes the tackle. Like, little stuff like that. Those are some things that you can't coach or can't teach. He has that length. But so I saw him against NC State. I was there this year, and that was his best game of the year. I think he had like 2.5 sacks in that game. But Chris, you see him up close, it's like somebody's wearing a costume.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't look like he's every bit of 6'7", 275 pounds. I think his wingspan was close to 87 inches, and then his arms were like 36 and a half, which is monstrous number. So I could see him, Seattle at 5. That's their type. Somewhere along those lines, Detroit. I could see Detroit taking him, pairing him with Aiden Hutchinson, and also James Houston, the late round kid that they hit on last year too. So that type of length, that type of production, I just don't see that type of player getting outside of the top 10.
Yeah, it's interesting because he's got a very interesting body type. As you put it, it looks like he's wearing a costume. It's hard to project a guy's ceiling when he has that kind of length, and I mean that in a good way. It's just you cannot coach that, and it's such a differentiating factor. The Van Ness kid is also interesting from Iowa. I mean, he hadn't started a game for Iowa. I don't look at that as a positive. I mean, I don't know that anybody looks at that as a positive. I actually look at it as a negative. I know a lot of people are like, that's not what it's about. Turn on the tape, check this kid's combine measurements out. I know he had a really nice week. What do you make of him? When I turn on the tape, I don't see it yet. Not in the top 10, but I know the way this thing goes. You take the best available player at the position. Does his lack of production or not being able to start at the collegiate level scare you at all?
Well, I'll start with the no starts thing, and I think what everybody's missing with that is that's just Iowa's way of doing things.
Yeah.
Like, they're going to start seniors. That's just what they do. That's what they've done throughout history, especially along the defensive line. So the no starts thing doesn't really bother me just because that's just what they believe in. Like, they could have a 5-star kid that's a true freshman, and they have this senior that's played 50 or 60 games for them. They're going to start that senior.
Yeah.
Like, that's just what they believe in for whatever reason. That's just how Kirk Ferentz is. And that's what happened with Van Ness. Everybody saw when he came in that relief pitcher role, this dude is throwing a 100-mile-per-hour fastball. That's just who he is. So He's a bit of a projection right now just because everything is attack the midline of blockers. He bull rushes everybody. That's just what he does. So he's just going to have to understand how to use his hands and be more creative as far as winning around the edge. So I think that's the big thing that's going to make or break his career is that he has to understand and develop some more tools in his bag. He has to get some more tools in his bag just because you're not going to be able to just run down the middle of NFL blockers. People are just going to anchor and they're just going to lock you out. So that's the thing that he's going to have to learn on the next level.
Yeah, and to play so high, I mean, he is a high cut guy. To go out and bench 17 reps is not a great showing. I do think when you play high, you've got to be a freakishly strong guy up top to be able to push people around. So that's definitely something that gives me a bit of pause. And then another one of the higher cut guys that's rated pretty high, and I would rate him ahead of Van Ness, but behind Tyree, would be Miles Murphy, the kid from Clemson. I got to be honest, he's got some of the face value traits of somebody who's a 10, 15 sack guy in the NFL. When you look at his measurables and, the stock he comes from being at Clemson, all that stuff, the production was high. But there's just something about him that gives me a little bit of pause. Maybe it's a little bit of stiffness. Maybe it's a little bit of a lack of explosiveness. Where do you think he falls?
So he didn't do anything at the combine.
Yeah.
And he's waiting to his pro day to do everything. And I'm actually going to be there on site for that pro day. So I'm excited to get eyes on him up close. Sitting behind him, he looks the part. I mean, he's 6'5", 275. He has the length that you're looking for, but you just wish he could have dominated a little bit more than what he did outside of the NC State game. You just didn't see him take over games like you would have wanted to see from a top 10 pick. So that's something that scouts kind of question about him right now. They just want to see him take over a little bit more. But as far as the explosiveness, the traits, he has it all. You just want to see it show up more consistently on tape.
And the defensive tackles, man. Actually, I'll start with a tweener. This Thule kid from USC. This kid that supposedly had played closer to 290, has been listed at 290, weighed in at 266. There were some questions as to whether or not he was going to go down or try to stay up and lean into being an interior guy, or if he was going to, try his hand at edge. It looks like he's marketed himself as an edge rusher. When I watch him on tape, I don't know that he has the explosiveness to capture edges with regularity. What he is good at is he's slippery, and he'll attack face up on a man and then get to half man really quickly. I kind of worry about projecting him at the next level as an edge guy due to that lack of explosiveness. How do you think that he performed this week, and how high could somebody like that go?
He had a good week overall. I think he really shined in the on-field drills. You were able to see that slippery nature going through the bags. He had plenty of pop in his hands, but his feet were really good going through the bags. And the turn and corner drill, the wave drill, and then when they were going around the hoops, grabbing the towels off of the ground, he looked really good doing that. The big thing with him is just where do you play him?
Yeah.
I think that's going to be the big dilemma about him, just because you can't put him at 3 technique just because he's going to get washed with double teams. He's not able to hold at the point. And then do you play him off of the edge? Can he set an edge consistently as a run blocker? That's going to be, or as a run defender. I think that's going to be the big dilemma about him. But as far as the athleticism, being a third down rusher that you bring in on late down situations to get after the passer, he's going to be that. But where do you play him? And then how high do you draft a player like that?
Yeah, and when you look at another guy who's described as a bit of a tweener, and he's obviously a defensive tackle, and maybe my favorite prospect out of these D linemen relative to what I had heard about them, the more I learned about Kalijah Cansey, I really like the guy. He's slippery, he's twitchy, he's a good finisher. He looks at home in a backfield, like he really sifts through trash well. How high could this guy go? I mean, I know there's another Pittsburgh defensive tackle who is a little bit undersized in recent years, that makes you feel pretty good about taking a Pitt D tackle at 290. But what do you see when you watch him, and how high could he climb?
Well, I don't like comparing anybody to what I like to call an alien.
Me neither.
Out there for the He's different, man. I don't like comparing anybody to Aaron Donald, but you see a lot of similarities in Kancey from just an explosive factor. Like his first step is just unbelievable, and then his closing speed is what really helps him get some sack numbers. And you're gonna hate me for saying this, but against Virginia, that
He
was his
was,
best game.
yeah,
He could have had 7 sacks
yep,
in that game that I count. He ended up with 3, I believe it was, but there were so many missed opportunities that he had in that game. And then North Carolina was another game where they just couldn't block him. And
yeah.
he's so quick, not only with his first step, but his hands are so quick too. So it's not only a quick first step, but he's really quick with his hands too. So before these linemen even reach out, he's racing past them. So I think with him, the big thing that is going to probably make or break him on the next level is just how firm is he at the point of
Yes.
attack as far as a run defender. Just because you can play him at 3. Now he played mostly 1 at Pitt, which I think was a disservice to him just because he got washed so much by double teams. But if you play him at 3, can he hold
Yeah.
against those double teams? So that's going to be the big difference for him being a 3-down player as opposed to a late down rusher. But I think it could go in the back end of the first round. Cincinnati, the Eagles. I think the Eagles will be a great
Oh,
spot for
yeah.
him, pairing him with Davis and how much they rotate their defensive linemen, especially along the interior. So teams at the back end of the first round, I think, could have a lot of interest in him, but it wouldn't surprise me if he goes higher too.
And then what do we make of Brian Brzee? I mean, like, hey, I've been sick the entire 2022 season. I mean, I had a sore throat, I had a viral infection, I had all. It was a down year for him. Obviously, a guy who was a big name in college football a year ago, still going to be highly coveted. Looks smooth and fluid in the on-field drills, but he's a high-cut guy. What do you make of Brian Brzee and his ceiling, and might he be the first guy taken when it comes to interior defensive linemen?
Yeah, he's another one that's a tough eval just because, he was going through the unfortunate situation that happened with his sister
Yeah.
passing away too. So obviously that had a huge negative effect on him. And there was just some games where the effort wasn't always there. So he's one that you would love to meet with at the combine just to see exactly what happened. You would love to pop the hood up just to see what he was thinking psychologically and mentally, and just have him explain some things that happened with reps on certain reps. But he's another one that they kind of had a disservice with just because they primarily played him as 5 technique, and he's not a 5 technique on the next level. He's clearly a 3. You can play him inside. You can reduce him inside and play him at 1 sometimes too. But I think he'll be fine on the next level. I still think he goes in the first round, and he tested really well too. I thought I thought he was one of the better testers too. So it's probably a situation of where you have to take into account the personal aspect of it as far as what he was going through. And then, like I said, he's one you would love to sit down and meet with just to see exactly what was happening with him.
He's a tough one to pin for me. Is there a comp that's flown around when it comes to Brian Brzee?
There's not one that I love. Yeah, there's not one that I love
Yeah.
that comes to mind. But I mean, he's super athletic, has a really good first step, and another kind of worry that's going on with him is that a lot of his production came off of twist game and
Twist.
stunts,
Yeah.
so where he was designed to get open, whether he was the crasher or the looper. A lot of his sack production came off of those games inside.
Yeah, for sure. When I watched him for a high cut guy, I saw a lot of standing up and waiting on a penetrator and that sort of thing. I'd love to see him get vertical in a 3. As you said, he's not really a 5. But at the next level, obviously, he's going to be in that B gap, getting vertical, and we'll see how that projects out. But talking about these O linemen, man, wrapping it up with the big guys and the guys who run behind them. Maybe the craziest story was we had a dude tear his ACL and then go in
Yeah.
there and bench 38 reps or whatever it was, 37 reps, which is the combine high for the year, on that bad ACL. Who was that kid? Was it a
It was Andrew Voorhees.
uh-huh?
He's from USC.
Yep, USC kid. That's just incredible. I mean, that was just an incredible story. But who do you think out of the top 5 or so offensive tackles, and I know that there might not be a consensus top 5, top 10 pick this year, but it's a deep class. Who do you think position themselves the best to possibly be a riser into that echelon of draft picks?
So it's the two guys that Well, they are projected to be borderline first round picks right now, but they're seen as the two best right tackles in the draft this year. And it's Darnell Wright, a player that, he was a big time recruit coming in. I think he was like top 10 in this class, 5-star. But consistency and then just being overweight was a lot of the big worries with him. His first 2 seasons and then his final 2 years, he just blew up and he performed really, really well, especially this past season. He shut down Will Anderson. He was terrific in that game against Alabama. He did really well against B.J. Ojulari, who was a very talented edge rusher from LSU that some people have projected in the first round. And then Brian Bresee in the bowl game. So he's just stacking up these wins against players that we're going to hear their names called very early in the draft. And he's consistently played really well against them. And I thought he looked the best of all the kids as far as the on-field drills. And then the other right tackle that I want to talk about is Big DeJuan Jones from Ohio State. 6'8", 374 pounds. I think that's what he came in as. And it's not always pretty with him as far as the technique. It's not going to look as far as how you exactly teach it, but he just doesn't get beat.
Yeah.
So it's like, how can I knock him unfairly for that when he's out here just taking care of business, even though it's his own way? And I think he came in with like an 88-inch wingspan, which is monstrous for an offensive tackle. So whenever he gets hands on you, it's like he just cancels you out. And it's not like you can run through him just because he's 6'8", 374 pounds. You're not going to run through that dude. And if you try to beat him up the edge, he's athletic enough to get hands on you. And then when he gets hands on you, he's just going to run you up the rim of the pocket. So he's one that I like a lot too. And it wouldn't surprise me if both of those guys go in the back end of the first round.
Yeah, I mean, he's a true tackle. I mean, you don't project him anywhere else. But a lot of these tackles this year seem to be former guards or guys that can move around. And that versatility might help them when it comes to being picked higher. I mean, you look at the Skoronski kid. He's played all 5 positions. You mentioned Darnell Wright, who's a former guard. Paris Johnson, former guard. So there's a lot of guys with versatility in this group. How about the running back group, man? This is one of these years that's going to challenge the group think on not drafting running backs high, because there are some really good players. Obviously, Robinson from Texas and Gibbs from Bama are the two standouts, but some interesting names sprinkled in there. Who helped themselves the most this week at running back?
Yeah, and I think outside of corner, tight end, and edge rusher, I think this is probably the deepest group in the draft. And I think you're spot on as far as with running backs. Everybody says don't take one of these guys in the first round, but we have a player that's probably going to be a consensus top 5 player as far as when you're talking about just stacking all of these players regardless of position. And Bijan Robinson, I think he's my number 4, number 5 player overall right now. But in a deep class, how high do you take these guys? And I think back to the Super Bowl. You see Miles Sanders of the Eagles, who was a 2nd-round pick, Isaiah Pacheco of the Chiefs, who was a 7th-round pick. It's just you just don't take those guys high anymore. It's just such a disposable position, and with it being running back by committee, there's just no reason to take those guys high anymore. But if you get a guy that's a top 5 talent like a Saquon Barkley type and Bijan Robinson, this guy keeps slipping down the board, at some point you got to take the risk, just because the draft is all about you want to hit on these players, just because it's a crapshoot. Everybody knows that the draft is basically an educated guess. But if we have a top 5 player that's sitting there on the draft board, he's slipping into the late teens, early 20s, eventually somebody's going to pull the trigger and take the risk on him just because he's so good at the position.
How about a guy I could fit in my pocket? The kid from Kansas State, Deuce Vaughn, 5'5". He's the smallest guy ever measured at the combine, which actually surprised me, but it makes sense. Is that height a concern for people? The way a fan might look at that and say, hey, 5'5", he's too small. But I mean, when you look at running back and you're evaluating these guys, I never think about it from that standpoint. Like how tall is this guy? Now, I know it could affect his stock when it comes to catching the ball outside the backfield. His catch radius is probably not real big. But when you look at Deuce Vaughn, is he a guy that could see himself drafted on the second day, or is he a guy that's going to be later in the draft?
I think probably, if I had to guess, I would say 5th round. I think that's probably where he ends up going, just because he's not going to meet the threshold of every team, just because 5'5", that's extremely small. But We saw a guy like Tariq Cohen go in the 4th round, I believe it was, who has a very similar skill set. And Cohen had a lot of success before injury started to pile up for him. But with Deuce Vaughn, I think he's much better as far as in between the tackles. And we saw him in the bowl game against Alabama. He was great,
Yeah.
even though they ended up getting beat pretty bad. But he was great in that game. But as far as receiving ability, he has it. He's a firecracker in between the tackles. He runs very hard. He has really good contact balance. And then the thing that you worry about, of course, is pass protection. Of course, you're not going to ask him to hold up in that aspect, but he's going to be a dynamic receiver from day one. So if he goes somewhere like San Francisco, I think would be a great spot for him. Philly would be a good spot for him. Miami, I think would be a great spot for him, like a Raheem Mostert type of player.
Mm-hmm.
I think he can be that. Obviously, he's not going to be a bell cow guy. He just doesn't have the frame for that. But being that second or third guy in the committee, I think he could be a welcomed addition to somebody.
Yeah, he's got to work on those cut blocks, man. He's down there anyways. He's got to work on those cut blocks. Pass pro is definitely going to be an issue for somebody of that stature. Jordan Reid, ESPN draft analyst, one of the best in the game, man. I appreciate you joining us and catching us up on all things combine because, as I mentioned, I have been on vacation, so this is very helpful. And I know the people at home are appreciative. Thank you, Jordan, for the time.
No problem. Thanks as always, Chris. I always appreciate coming on.
Yeah, man. Anytime.
Listen to the full podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast streaming platforms. Wherever you want to get the podcast, you can get the podcast. Pretty simple. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Podcasts get pretty wild. This is real tame.